Rob's child. Nothing I say is investment advice, and I have no intention to replace any content of security analysis, but to discuss its contents and open it up for discussion. Today's chapter is chapter 44 on implications of liquidating value stockholder management relationships. Overall, I wanted to start by mentioning that this was probably the easiest chapter to understand so far, and I don't know if it's because I'm this far into the book or this material is just easier to grasp, but either way, had a lot of very good information. As usual, a lot of repetition and some examples to drive some points in. But let's go over it. So, the overarching theme of this chapter is how basically securities become mispriced because of the fact that there is management and that there are people involved. You know, the people running the company, the CEO, the people that work there, the managers, they're human. They want to benefit themselves just as much as the stockholders want to benefit themselves. And that's what really kind of creates all of the problems that he brings up in this chapter. And the first one being that, you know, when it comes down to it, he mentions how liquidating value ends up not mattering because they won't do it. Companies don't typically liquidate. And so that's really the primary reason why you can find some stocks sometimes that if you were to sell the entire, just all the assets and liquidate the whole thing, the stockholders would end up with more money than the current share price because the share price, you know, it assumes that the management is essentially incompetent enough to not liquidate the company when they really should be. Um, I found that a great first point to start off this chapter with. I'll mention in chapter 43, I actually brought this issue up regarding stockholder management relationships and how that, I had questions if you watch my video, and it's great because this chapter goes right into addressing everything. And so I found that to be funny. Anyway, moving on, I'm just going to pull out a quote regarding this subject that I found very funny. He says, and I quote, "There is a distinct relationship between the value of securities and the intelligence and alertness of those who hold them." And, you know, even this long ago, I was under the assumption that securities holders that long ago maybe were more aware of what they hold compared to people today, but I think it might be about equal. And, one of his big criticisms and problems that he sees is essentially the stupidity of the stockholders, the people that own companies that don't do things properly for themselves in many ways. And so this naturally leads to a lot of problems and issues that can come up. A point he brings up after that he's brought up before in the book is that you should have equal reason to care about what's going on with the company when you buy shares of a company, but also when you hold the shares of the company. And what can happen is people can buy something and forget about it, and he says, you shouldn't do that. I mean, your typical stockholder today isn't reading every report that comes out of every company that they hold. Many people that manage their own securities have hundreds of different stocks, and it's just not viable for one person to keep track of all that. And then I'll bring up a point regarding that at the end regarding managers as well. And there's more new problems today. Well, recently with all the news of BlackRock, what they're doing, well, they allegedly doing more recently, but I digress. Let's move on. There's a little subtitle here, how he says that the typical stockholder is apathetic and docile. And he describes them as an animal in captivity. And, as a stockholder, it's like I'm saying, it's not hard to feel that way, especially when you don't really even have the resources to fully comprehend everything that's going on with an individual company, unless you own like 5 companies and you're really just tracking what's going on with each one of those. I mean, I guess that pays tribute to Warren Buffett, who says, his whole thing is pick 20 and that's it for your whole life. But anyway, moving on. The main point of being that the typical stockholder acting, essentially being an animal in captivity is that they give too much power to the management and they don't really act like they're really owners, even though they are owners. The when you own Tesla stock, you are Elon Musk's boss. It's hard for people to really grasp that idea and hard to believe it. It's like, well, yeah, sort of, because, on the paper. No, it's like that's actually the legal, hierarchical system. That's how it works. The stockholders, I mean, granted, he probably owns more stock than you do, so he has more control, but, in the role of CEO, he's your employee if you own stock. And I was just talking about this earlier today with some people, how, a lot of people own stocks and baskets of stocks in these ETFs, and they're owners and they don't even know. They have no idea that they are even owners, and that's a whole nother level of being apathetic and docile animals in captivity. I mean, it's hilariously sad is the best way I'd describe it. To how those relationships kind of just naturally end up working out today. So then, and we're only on the second page of the chapter now that I've gotten through, but on page 595, he quotes himself from 335, basically making a point that, or reiterating a point from obviously earlier in the book, that if the owners give up control, the stockholders, you, the stockholder, if you give up your control, really nobody should be in control of it, because, you know, that's he goes through the logic of that and kind of makes sense of it. And again, it's the best way for me to describe how this relationship ends up playing out. Again, it's hilariously sad is the best way I would describe it. And so I love this, how he goes over what he calls basically 3 bad assumptions that stockholders make on page 596. And you'll hear these, this isn't old information. You'll hear your typical passive investor today make the same exact arguments. And again, hilariously sad. Number one, the first bad assumption is that management knows more than the shareholders. Number two, management has no interest or responsibility in its stock price. And he goes more into detail about that later in the chapter, that second point. And then number three, if the stockholder doesn't like management, just sell it. So that last point is particularly, like, not cool. like, but it makes sense, right? If you're a stockholder and you don't like what management is doing, then you have the right to sell it. Well, you should just sell it. Well, that's not how it's supposed to work, because you're an owner of the company. You're not just some guy gambling on the success or failure of companies. You're an owner. There's a difference between, too many people don't really fully comprehend what stock ownership is. Um, and that's one of the big things that I'm getting again from this. And it still holds extremely true to this day. So then we move on, page 596, talking about conflicts of interest. Basically, there's 5 listed. Number 1, the compensation of the officers, the people that that run the company, whether the company should expand or not. When he's mentioned this earlier in the book too, when companies expand, what happens is the people in charge suddenly have more people that they're in charge of, and it, raises their status in the world. Because the company's bigger now. We have more employees, and so that because they have more responsibility, they can raise their compensation as well, and that causes a lot of companies to unnecessarily expand when they really shouldn't be. And he's discussed that many times throughout this book. That's one of the big problems. Another conflict of interest is whether or not a company should pay a dividend. He goes into more detail about that later in the chapter too, and he goes over some examples that he finds very offensive. And then number 4, another conflict of interest is for the management to decide to continue or liquidate. Again, that was from the beginning of the chapter. We just talked about how, more often than not, the reason a stock price can sell below its liquidating value is because the stockholders are all assuming altogether that the company is not going to liquidate. It's not going to do the smart thing, even if it should. So, all hilariously sad the way this works, if you really think about it. But and then number 5, operating on insider information, and that still to this day, I think there's better regulation involving insider information. I think that it continues to get better, but there's always been problems, and there certainly is still problems today. And I'd say some of the problems that he points out in this chapter have been really swept under the rug, and people just, we just accept some of these problems as not important. In particular with the buyback thing. We'll get into that. All right, so next 2 main points. When you're buying a stock, another way to think of it is you're hiring operators to run a company. That's what you're doing. You're hiring people when you purchase a stock. And so when you're purchasing something, to have that be the way you think is useful. And then number 2, there's a bunch of points, so I'm just going to go through some of the notes that I wrote and go through them. So the next one is, you can't always count on the directors to do what's best for the shareholders because of self-interest, and the officers / CEOs are often tied to the board, or in cahoots, and that's another huge thing that's going on. Board of directors of companies don't tend to be your average Joe. They tend to be people that may even be related to the people running the company. The top brass or whatever of the company. And so Um, it's just, as a common shareholder, something to be highly aware of and highly um, careful with. He mentions, funny enough, how what ends up happening in companies is that the officers, the people that are running the company, end up choosing the directors and not the other way around. The directors being the people that tell the officers what to do in behalf of the shareholder interest, but it ends up being the opposite in many cases, and so that's obviously it's like not really the way it's supposed to work, but it ends up working out that way a lot of the time. He mentions a point here too that stock stockholders should pay attention to any criticism that's going on of officers, of directors of the company, to, you know, don't ignore, well, when you own, especially directly, stock of a company, it's important not to just assume that what people are saying about this or that is false. Look into it yourself, I think, is the main thing. Be a smart investor. Don't make bad assumptions. And then he makes a point that he says most examples of excessive compensation to CEOs was before 1933, and points out some examples. That's a pretty big criticism of many CEOs today, especially when you're taking a look at the differences of compensation of your regular CEO today and your average worker. It's gotten way out of hand, way worse today. I think if Graham were alive today, he would be pointing this out and screaming loudly. But let's move on. Again, we reiterate human nature is to decide to benefit yourself, and so you have to realize these companies are not machines. They're not completely AI driven, although maybe someday we will have companies that are completely AI driven. But we don't today, and so the directors want to benefit themselves, and that could include their relationships with the officers of the company. The officers want to benefit themselves. Always remember that. But then he mentions that there are some new as of 1940 regulations that helped with insider trades, and the basically becoming public knowledge. And if you don't know, anyone with 10% or greater holding within a company is an insider by default, and has to basically report to the public all of their purchases and sales of their holdings, and that might be what he was referring to there. And one point I want to bring up: every once in a while you hear about a company that has zero salary or $1 salary. I don't know, it was Facebook or maybe it was Elon Musk. They just own so much of the company that it just makes me think of that. But something like that, as a stockholder yourself, if the guy running the thing is depending on the price of the stock, and you own the stock, well then, I don't know, it sounds like you're probably in pretty good hands. Maybe you can assume that. I don't know. Okay, and again, at this point, we mentioned that the officers won't liquidate a company or part of it because it lowers their status. So yeah, even like trimming a company down, even if it's the smart thing to do, officers are going to be very reluctant to do that because it lowers their status. They have less people they're managing. The company looks smaller. Their prospects for becoming bigger and more important and higher paid themselves goes down, and they don't want that, so they're going to try to avoid that. And again, usually the the board are tied to the officers, and so that's a common problem that I'm guessing is most definitely still prevalent today. And he mentions, therefore stockholders need to vote for what they want in cases like this, where they really should be trimming it down and they're not. And how companies, at the end of the day, when you have a company that's not liquidating or partially liquidating when they should be, he says, you know what, at the end of the day, this isn't actually a management problem. This is an ownership problem. The stockholders aren't voting. They aren't standing up for themselves. And in a way, it's a problem from the ownership, not from the management, even though it seems like it is from the management. It's not directly. Anyway. And then we have a point. He says stockholders need to determine if stock price is below liquidation value. There's only really two possible reasons. Either management is wrong for not liquidating, or the market price is wrong. It's one or the other. And so that's the thing. If liquidating value is above the market cap of a company, it can only mean it's a very logical thing. Either the management is wrong and they're just saying, oh no, everything's fine, and the market's saying no, everything's not fine, because we're not even willing to pay liquidating value for your company, or the market's wrong and management is right, and it's just underpriced, and it will resolve itself accordingly eventually by the laws of nature, by the laws of if all of a sudden it's paying a 50% dividend for 3 years in a row, well, anyway. Actually, he mentions in the chapter later on a company that did pay a 20% dividend. And think of that: 5 years, you get the whole price of your stock back. If that were to continue anyway. Again, main takeaway here is that there are differing parties with differing interests. My takeaway is to find companies that care about the stockholders over other things. And I feel like Warren Buffett has done a good job of that, finding companies that are run very well. He calls them great companies, that really look to the shareholders as the owners and treat them as such, and do things in their interests, and that's what really makes a good company. Now, so let's just say that the next point here I'm just going to go through is that not all cases against officers are totally valid, and so can sometimes be improperly motivated. And my take on it is that don't always join the mob when something seems off. Look at the facts yourself. Look at what's going on. So anyway, all of this talk, it makes you feel like, oh, I'm an owner of a company. It doesn't matter if we're clubbing baby seals or something, like whatever's best for the company, whatever's going to benefit profits. This is the first time in the book, on almost page 6, around page 600 somewhere, where this is the first time he admits that it is, and I quote, heartless and extreme to disregard everything else, but specifically disregard employees completely just for profit. Um, However, he says, with that said, nothing is really gained by confusing the issue. So that's an interesting way to sort of show a little bit of empathy and at the same time understand that, this is the reality of the situation. So again, it's not about, this part isn't really about clubbing baby seals for a profit, but it's more about how they're treating the people that run the company. They're people too. But it's just like but it's a tough world. So if it doesn't work out, hopefully you'll find another way to make it work out. I mean, that's the you get into the reality of how things work and capitalism in general. But anyway, let's move on. He goes on to how he philosophizes about that it's mean to liquidate for the workers' sake, and he says he digresses into irrelevance for security analysis in this issue, even though like you can feel bad for workers getting fired in a liquidation. It's not really part of analyzing securities. So, and that's the main point. He kind of just cuts the conversation off there and moves on. So now we get on to the point where he discusses how officers are sort of not responsible for the stock price, but they should be concerned about the stock price, and not just if it's low, but also if it's too high. And I found that to be a fascinating take. But, on the low end, obviously, for holders to be able to sell securities at a fair price is an important part of the owners. If people aren't willing to buy it, what's going on? I mean, if the whole market is suppressed, like major recession or depression, that's one thing. But in there are going to be cases where the stock price is suppressed and it really shouldn't be, and that's when people running the company really do have a little bit of a responsibility to do something about it, whether it's educate people about what's going on with the company, reassuring people, sharing information that can help people understand. I mean, that is partly a responsibility of officers to the owners of the company. So he states that management for stockholders should really work to prevent absurdly high or unduly low security prices in markets. What can happen is you can have frustrated management acting like, oh, it doesn't matter, like, okay, the market's just pricing things. But and then one of the bad things that can occur from this is insider trading for mispriced securities. So if something is clearly overvalued and the company's not calming people down and saying, hey, look, I'm glad you're so excited, but these are the real projections here, that would be inappropriate action. Otherwise, what happens is you can have insiders taking advantage of this. Let's say you have a stock price let's say you have a company that has an intrinsic real some real value of $10 a share, and it's selling for $100 a share. Well, insiders can short it, or they can offload can offload a bunch of their shares, being like, well, I mean, heck, if the market wants to pay this much, why not take advantage for me? And then equally on the opposite side, when things are suppressed, when they have more cash than um, and better business prospects than the market is pricing in by like a long shot, they can eat up lots of shares without telling anybody, and that's not really um, very fair or good to the stockholders, um, because these are real people that are selling. you know there are people that own shares that are selling these shares at a price that is too low, and it's not fair to them. They're not getting the price that they should be getting for their ownership. So it's really interesting how I never had thought of that before, how a company can essentially be seen as irresponsible for their stock price being too high or too low. Again, in regard to this, he says that directors should be put in proper effort. They should put in proper effort to correct discrepancies of security prices and markets, same as everything else they do for stockholder interests. And then he goes over ways that prices can be corrected specifically, and I just talked about a few, but these are his specific points. He says they should get shareholder attention, that if shares are below liquidation price, and they need to announce why they're not liquidating. So that's in the case of if it's too low. Number two, another way to correct a mispriced security is to pay out a dividend equal to the liquidating value, even if earnings aren't sufficient and they have enough accumulated profits in cash. And this can happen sometimes, where they literally have enough cash to essentially, let's say the stock price is $5, to give a 100% dividend, be like, oh, here's your $5. That can that can certainly give investors a lot more confidence in what they're holding, because they didn't even have to sell the stock at $5. They just got their $5 in a dividend payment. That sounds like a wonderful way to resolve the situation. I don't know how often that happens today, but it seems like oh yeah, he goes through examples. I forgot about that. So let's number three, to offer a buyback at a pro rata price. And I haven't heard of a company doing this before. I've heard of companies announcing buybacks, but not, at a set price. Say it's selling in the market for $5 a share, and they're like, okay, you know what, we're gonna buy this many shares at $10 a share, on this date. And they announce that. Well, the market will suddenly magically be like, oh, it'll at least be just a little below 10, so that people can assume that they'll be able to sell it at 10. And they call it a wind up, a term there. No, sorry, a wind up is a bankruptcy, or a wind up. So that's in the case where they just declare bankruptcy, or sell the entire company to another company, where maybe there's a company that has enough resources where they can be bought up and become a part of another company. If it's it's selling below liquidating value, it's like you'd think that there's likely a company out there that would be able to and willingly purchase your entire company, if for no other reason to liquidate it themselves and make the profit. So if that's the case. So then we have examples, 1930, of, which is of course right after the Great Collapse that started the Great Depression in 1929, but the Otis Company sent out a circular of paying a very large dividend to remedy the market price, and they basically engaged in a piecemeal liquidation over time, and they were, from my understanding, they were basically made whole. So they did the right thing apparently in this situation. Good job, Otis Company. And then we have an example of the wool company. Eventually, the stockholders voted to liquidate, and then they got paid the current assets. And he says it was noteworthy because the shareholders were given this choice. And that's another thing, I brought up earlier in the chapter. Oh, the shareholders should just vote for this or that. Well, if the directors don't put out a circular, a way for the shareholders to vote on something, these directors are voted in, but then and they're the ones controlling on what the shareholders are even going to vote on. So that's a whole another part of this. And yeah, animal in captivity. Most stockholders really are. Hilariously sad. Again, that's like the theme of this chapter for me. Again, he reiterates again for the fifth time. Stock price can end up below its liquidation because of earnings, not liquidation value, and that's how markets tend to price things. It takes a look at the earnings. If the earnings prospects moving forward don't look good, it can end up trading at lower than liquidation value, which doesn't make sense, but it's how the world works. And he has a chart and a list of examples of shareholders getting much more than their share price in liquidation. So that was, some companies doing the right thing for their shareholders. Hamilton, I wrote Hamilton Wooden commended for a big repurchase at pro rata amount. So they repurchased at like a certain set price. All right, and then we have he goes on to talk about buybacks during the Great Depression happened in massive amounts without notice to the shareholders. And so you have these companies basically taking advantage of stupid people selling their shares for lower than liquidation price, and the insiders essentially taking advantage of that. And that's not very nice. That's not very fair. And then we go on to an example of White Motor, where the management went from, I think he said 1921, really great management skills. Even when they weren't earning enough, they had enough money to keep the dividend paying. They were doing really well for a while, but then later on, management went sour apparently, because at one point they actually decided to cut the dividend, and at the same time rewarding employees by doing I think secretive repurchases or something to do with giving them more stock or something like that. So the point is that in a downturn, what happens is the stockholders get hurt because the dividend gets cut, and then the stock price goes down. But then in an upturn, the company's rewarding the employees and not rewarding the shareholders properly. And so shame on White Motor. I think it was in 1931 if I'm correct. And then another example of Westmoreland Coal, also cut a dividend even though they had plenty of cash. The essential pattern he says, and that comes out here is, the company cuts a dividend even though they have plenty of cash, the stock price plummets, and then the company buys up tons of cheap shares. And the way he writes in there, he seems disturbed by this. And, again, it's essentially hurting the current holders because, from a liquidity standpoint, they don't have, as much value in their holdings, and then it ends up oftentimes benefiting insiders, and that is not good. Shame on them. All right, and then we finish off with an excellent summary at the end of the chapter. Again, this whole chapter was very easy to read, very easy to understand, and pointed out a lot of good things. I hope the rest of the book is this easy. Some of the earlier chapters were very hard. This was not a hard chapter. This was a very good, easy chapter. But anyway, the summary is just excellent. I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself. But I want to talk about it. For me, it speaks volumes about how dumb and ignorant investors are and can be, and how easy it is essentially for insiders or even financial advisors. I mentioned earlier in this video about BlackRock, how their actions can even be malicious. People in cahoots, some of these big money managing corporations, are very likely tied to the directors, tied to the officers. They're all in cahoots with each other. And then, and then on top of that, you have states with, these days, with forced retirement plans. You're forced to own these securities, whether you want them or not, in a lot of cases. And it's a whole, it's a whole disastrous system. Today, I think certain things have gotten worse since the 1940s. Certain things have gotten better, but certain things have gotten worse regarding this subject specifically. And but anyway, point being that even financial advisors, on top of management and directors, can end up in situations where they're not doing their legally obligated responsibility of treating the stockholding public as the true owners of the companies. And that is chapter 44. Hope you enjoyed. Rob's Child.